Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining. You're welcome to pop a hello in the chat. I'm happy to see them. Also, as with previous sessions, anytime you've got a question, please pop it in the chat in YouTube Live. Just a quick reminder, whether you're watching this after the fact or whether you're watching this live, you can always change your quality settings of your stream on your side if you struggle to see some of the sliders or the text in Lightroom. You just go to the quality settings of the stream on mobile devices. It's in the little 3-dot thing, and if you're streaming this on your laptop or desktop device, then it's at the little settings icon, the little gear icon, and you can swap it to something like full HD video to be able to see nicely once we're inside of Lightroom. Hi. Great. I'm seeing some chats coming through already. Great stuff. Thank you for joining this session. This is session number 3 in our series for Joburg Photowalkers. Right now it's all about Lightroom and editing in Lightroom. So yeah, we will get started, and today we are focusing on let's call it exposure and the tones of your image. And that's all in the Lightroom version I'm using. It's under the light section or the light tab. So when you're editing, it's called light, and we're looking at the sliders inside there. In future sessions, we will look at things like color and all the other little all the other different sections inside of Lightroom. So we're tackling them one section at a time, seeing what those sliders do, what we can adjust in those sections. Okay, so this is let's say the first more in-depth technical one. In previous sessions, we looked at things like workflow and the philosophy of editing and why we should be editing and organizing our images. And this one will actually get stuck into actual editing of an image. We will be adjusting the tones, the exposure, and fixing some issues, common issues that people get when they actually look at their images after they went out, let's say, for a photo walk or something. So we'll also have a quick look at when cameras get things wrong when it comes to exposure, why they get it wrong, and what we can do in Lightroom to actually fix that. Good stuff. I'm seeing some comments come through in the group as well. Welcome. No problem if you can't comment in YouTube. If you've got any questions at any time, I'm happy to look at the chat every once in a while as we carry on. Just pop your question in the chat. One other thing is, if you've got any specific problems with images in future or after photo walks or something and you want me to have a look at it, we can always look at some of your images in one of these sessions and see how we can fix an issue, or how maybe we can edit for a specific mood on one of your images. So you're welcome to send me through any images or questions even after the session. There's a WhatsApp group, there's the meetup that's scheduled. You can comment there. There's also emails going out from MailChimp. You can always just reply to one of those emails. So there's plenty of ways to keep up to date, and even between sessions to get some advice if you need it. Great. Good stuff. Excited to learn about exposure in the comments. Good. I'm glad you are excited. I'm excited as well. So this is really key to photography. This is key to just making images that might otherwise have been thrown away images to actually be good images, and to fix some issues that we get when we're out taking photos. So some of these exposure issues, actually a whole lot of them you can fix when you're actually taking the images, if you know what you're doing with the different camera modes. But once in a while, the conditions are such that you're taking an image in a specific way so that you know you can edit it afterwards to get where you want. Okay. Let's hop straight into Lightroom and carry on from there. Good. We're back into Lightroom. We've got a couple of images here. In this session, we're going to look at 3 example images and how to edit them, and also what I did to get those images. But before we do, let me show you with this little example card. So this is just a color checker card, and it's a good example to show you what Lightroom does and what the different settings in Lightroom does. So we're going to go to edit on this image, and we've got our edit panel on the right. So this is where all our editing sections are for effects, color, and all the different things. As I said, today we are starting with light. Now, when you're looking at the light panel, the thing that you also have to keep in mind is this little histogram at the top. So if you know your camera, and if you are using histograms, or if you've been on some training or watched some videos about how to use your camera and get good exposure, you'll know that the histogram is in many cases key to getting good exposures. So whether you are using maybe a mirrorless camera and you can see the histogram, or if you're using live view and you can see the histogram while you're taking the images and adjusting on the go, or if you're looking at your playback after taking an image and then looking at your histogram to see how you did with your exposure, it's a very handy tool while out taking images and using your camera. So like I said, whether you've got mirrorless or DSLR, you'll have a histogram available, whether it's while taking the image or after. The little light meter in your camera is also a good thing. That helps a lot. And we'll also look at some examples of where the camera tends to get things wrong when you're using the built-in light meter on your camera. So first off, let's quickly talk about how your camera measures light and gets the exposure. So you've got different modes obviously on your camera, and especially in the full automatic modes, the camera will obviously take control of settings like it might take control of your ISO. If that's set in auto, it might take control of your shutter speed and your f-stop to make sure that it's getting a good exposure. The one thing to keep in mind is the difference between actual light in the environment and what your camera sees. So as an example of that, and we'll look at some example images, if you are using a light meter, I don't know if you've got a light meter, let me show you this one. So a light meter like this, and the little sensor at the top, this little dome thing that it's got. A light meter like this allows you to measure the actual light that's falling on that little dome on the light meter. So what this gives me is, if I'm taking an ambient light reading, let's say I'm doing a portrait session, or I'm out in an environment and I'm measuring the ambient light, this will allow me to get the ambient light, and it's the light that's actually shining on the sensor. The other way of measuring light is the light reflecting from an object, which is what your camera tends to do. So the difference between the two is whether I put my light meter in front of maybe a black object or a black wall or a white wall, it's actually measuring the light coming from whatever light I've got, natural light or studio lights, onto the light meter. Okay. What my camera does when I'm pointing it, let's say at a black wall, is it's looking at the reflective light, and it might think that the scene is very dark, and it ups the exposure to get it maybe to look gray, which is not what we want. And the opposite is also true. If I point my camera at a white wall, a lot of light will be reflecting from that wall, and the camera might tend to drop the exposure because it's thinking things are too bright in the scene that you are looking at. Okay. Let's hop back into Lightroom with that in mind and start editing or looking at what these different sliders will do. If anybody's got a question so far, just pop it in the chat and we'll carry on from there. Good. Looking at this little card, so this is, let's say it's like an image you took, but these cards are set up with different color values and also then values from white to black. Black's actually on the outside, and all the different grays in between. So the nice thing with the color checker card like this is we can see how all these different blocks react to settings that we change. So if you're trying to figure out something in Lightroom and how something works, having a little chart like this is quite nice. This one is available for free on Wikipedia. We've got the address there on the side if you want to download it and play with it. The idea of this color checker is there's different colors that's available on it. So you can see what reds will do once you start editing things, what blues will do, all these different things. And they're supposed to be colors that you would find in different scenes, water or foliage and all different things. The first two are supposed to be skin tones, so a darker skin tone and a lighter skin tone. And then this is your monochrome or black and white, different values with the grays in between. So it's quite handy to see when you're looking at this, what the sliders do. We can also see we've got values all the way in our histogram there. Every little peak basically gives us one of these blocks. Good. So let's start with the light panel. So the light panel is where we adjust overall light, overall exposure, and we can also do fine tuning of some of the darker areas, some of the very dark areas, some of the lighter areas, some of the very light areas, and also your midtones, which is pretty much in the middle. So if you're looking at your histogram here in the corner, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit on this histogram. So if you're looking at this histogram all the way to the left, if you're looking all the way to the left of this histogram, black is basically the edge of where that histogram stops. Okay. As we move right, you go through your shadow areas or your dark areas towards your midtones here in the middle, towards your highlight areas on the right hand side, and then you're moving to your whites right up against the side on the right. Okay. So as we edit, we want to keep this in mind. Anything that we get to move straight up against this left hand side is going to be completely black. Anything that we move up to this right hand side of our histogram is going to be completely white. And what we need to keep in mind is, even if we've got something in our scene that, let's say, is blue, if we drop our blue to be dark enough, it turns black. And then also to keep in mind, if we up the exposure of that blue, eventually it's going to turn white. Okay, so we need to keep this in mind. As we drop our exposure towards black, even colorful objects will turn black, completely black when there's no light on them. If we push them to be brighter, eventually they will go a very pale color and then completely white. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind as you edit. If you've got colors and they start looking weird after you've moved some of these light based sliders around, that's exactly what's happening. You often find that adjusting some of these sliders, especially things like contrast and whites and black, will start messing up skin tones, and you might have to jump down into your color panel to fix those skin tones again. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Your exposure, even though we're working with just tones, it will influence your colors in an image. So a very good way to practice using these light and exposure panel, if you just want to get to know Lightroom, is to use it in black and white images, or just to switch to black and white on an image that you're busy editing. So that will show you the effect in the tones and the overall exposure without you seeing the effect on the actual colors. That's a good tip, and something that I would suggest is maybe going out and doing a few shoots and just editing those photos out in monochrome or black and white, making sure you're getting your exposures and your mood, the feeling of how dark or light these images are, exactly correct, without worrying about color. Especially if you're doing something like portraits, it's a lot easier getting your exposure values and your tones perfectly dialed in when you're going over to black and white, because things like your skin tones won't be affected as much. A lot of the time when you hop on over to color, you will need to use this light panel together with your color panel to make sure that you're preserving the skin tones especially. And the reason why skin tones is really important in our images is we as humans are really in tune with what skin tones look like and what people look like, and it's sort of a built-in maybe a safety mechanism, let's say, for you to be able to recognize when when somebody is looking off. So you can see when somebody's looking a little bit sick, when they're looking a little bit pale, when they're looking a little bit hot. And our brain processes this information and the skin tones very efficiently. So when you do portraits and the skin tones are off, you immediately see it. And you can, even people who are not photographers can see something's wrong with the image, even though they can't pinpoint or tell you what's wrong with that image. Okay. Let's change this back to color and see if there's any questions in the chat. Not yet. Looking good. Good stuff. Good stuff. That's looking good. Okay. Let's continue. So when we're looking at this color checker, the first little slider here says exposure. So our exposure will, in most cases, affect the middle part of our histogram, and then it will start to pull towards whatever side we are adjusting. So have a close look at these bottom gray squares, and you will see as I up my exposure, they tend to get more white until they are all white. As I drop my exposure down, you'll see everything drop down to black until pretty much the whole color checker is black. And on my histogram at the top, as I do this, you'll see everything slide to the left towards black when I'm going this way. And when I up my exposure, it goes to the right. Okay, so this is mainly affecting overall exposure. And as we said previously, even our colors that we're looking at are starting to move to white or black. So we're losing the color either to black or to white as we move this exposure slider. So when do we use exposure? Exposure is if our overall picture is either too dark or our overall picture is either too light. And in a lot of cases, we're actually setting our cameras to shoot on purpose a little bit dark, maybe a third, two-thirds, or a full stop darker, very often to preserve details in the sky in higher contrast situations. We might be actually setting our cameras to shoot too dark very often in different situations, and then we know that afterwards we're coming back into Lightroom and we're going to be actually just lifting our exposure a tiny bit. Now when it comes to this exposure slider, what we also want to keep an eye on is, or a nice little tip is, if you're editing on your laptop or on your desktop, you can hover your mouse over the little toggle in the middle and just use your up and down arrow keys to go a little bit and nudge it either way. So if you need to finally adjust any of the sliders in Lightroom, a good tip is to use the arrow keys. If you're editing on a mobile device like a tablet or a phone, then you can tap on one of the two sides and it will actually just move it a tiny bit, or you can grab the little round toggle and move it to one of the two sides by touching your touch screen, similar to what I did with the mouse here. So if I grab it, it goes wherever I point my mouse. If I click on a spot on the laptop, it's going to go that way. On a mobile device, it will just increment in that way. And then if I hover it and I use the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard, I can fine adjust wherever I want to go. So that's just something to keep in mind, which is quite nice. Okay, that's still looking good. Let's have a look at this little point curve at the bottom. So together with these sliders, the exact same things we can adjust at the top, we can also adjust on the point curve. So what I'm going to do is, when we cover a slider at the top, we're going to see how to adjust it at the bottom as well. So for instance, this exposure slider, moving it left and right, you can see the effect on the complete image. And if we're looking at our point curve at the bottom, I can click in the middle. So that's the midtones side. And if I just pull this up, you'll see I've got the same effect as increasing exposure. And if I pull this down, I've got a similar effect to decreasing the exposure. And I'll double click to get it to go away again. So there's two places where we can actually adjust the same thing. A lot of photographers, when they're really experienced in editing their own images, they prefer this point curve because you can finally adjust different areas of your image. So right on the left, again, we've got black. Right on the right-hand side, we've got white. We've got our midtones in the middle of this. We've got our shadow areas on this side. We've got our highlight areas on this side of this point curve. Now, the next thing that we can adjust is our contrast. What contrast does, you can either narrow the different exposure or the different areas in your, or tones in your image, or you can push them apart a bit. I think that's the easiest way to understand it. So increasing contrast will basically push your highlight areas to be closer to white and your darker areas to move closer to black. So you've got a wider range of tones in your image. Decreasing contrast would do the opposite. So it's bringing your highlight areas closer to be a little bit closer to your midtones, and your darker areas also moving towards your midtones. So it's basically compressing your histogram. We'll have a look at what it looks like on an actual image when we start editing it. But right now, if you look at the little gray blocks at the bottom, when I increase my contrast, you'll see that the white blocks are getting whiter, or the almost white ones are getting whiter. The almost black ones are pushing to be more black. And you'll see on the histogram there, it's pushing all these little blocks that we've got here, that's represented here, it's pushing them to the right and to the left to get them to spread out more. So that's going to basically, if you've got shadow areas, it makes them a little bit darker. If you've got highlight areas, it makes them a bit lighter. So it basically, look at me when or look at the histogram at the top, while I'm sliding it to the right, it's spreading it out. And if I'm going to the left, it's going to compress them and move them all closer together. So now, contrast to the left, you'll see as I go slowly to the left and you're looking at those blocks at the bottom, the darker ones are going to lighten up and the light ones are going to go more towards a mid-gray. Okay. And what you'll also notice on the colors, when my contrast is in the middle, these are all the normal sample colors. When I'm pushing my contrast to the right, the colors are getting more intense. There's more saturation in those colors as I go right. As I go left and I'm compressing the tonal range of this image, the colors are going to go more, look more pastel-like. So it's basically fading those colors so that it looks a bit more, more like a faded film look or something. So that's when we're going to the left there. We've got a question. Is it advisable to rather underexpose if you're not sure? That's a good question. Very good question. So for me, if I'm outside, if I'm walking through the city, I very often set my camera's exposure compensation to be either a third, 2/3, in some conditions even a whole stop underexposed. Why do I do this? Because I generally like detail in the sky. So if there's clouds and there's sky detail, your chances of preserving the sky detail and being able to edit the image properly is a little bit higher. If you're going to be shooting JPEG and not editing, very often you might not want to do this. You might want to expose perfectly, or if you want a really bright image, you might want to overexpose. If it's a very bright scene, you might want to overexpose so your camera doesn't compensate and bring those exposure values down for you. When I'm using my camera, I use pretty much all the modes on it. It's there, it's on that dial. And personally, I paid for the camera with all those modes, and I'm going to be using whichever mode is appropriate for me to getting the image. I know a lot of people prefer maybe aperture priority or full manual. That's great. But I think also when you're using your camera, it's good to know the limitations of these different modes. So for instance, full manual is great for learning how to use your camera, and it really improves your photography if you use it often. The limitation in full manual is speed. You slow yourself down when you're shooting full manual, and when it comes to street photography, very often you have to react quickly. So that's where maybe auto or program shift or aperture priority or shutter priority comes in. And knowing these modes and knowing what the camera does when you're using these modes, I think is very good. So when we're talking about underexposing, I think if you know you're going to be editing your images and if you're shooting raw, it's not a bad thing to underexpose, but you need to think about the environment you're shooting in and why you're doing it. It's not just always underexposed by 1/3 or 2/3 or something. I think that's not the way to think about it, and following recipes because somebody said to do something is I think can lead to some issues with images later. I think doing these things, knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it, is very good. So yeah, there's definitely instances, and a lot of instances, where underexposing is actually a really good thing to do, because then in editing you've got a lot of leeway in the edit to make a good image. But I don't think it's a hard and fast rule. And I'll show you some examples of my images where I actually overexposed by even a stop or two on purpose, because I was looking at the scene and I knew what I was looking for it, to get out of it. Okay. Just quickly, let's go through these again. So exposure, that's the overall, how bright and dark your image is. Contrast is the difference between bright areas and dark areas. So adding contrast pushes them apart. Decreasing contrast gets them closer together. So the difference between dark and light areas comes closer together by decreasing contrast. We'll see the effects now when we start editing a couple of images. I'm just moving through these. Highlights is the area right here in your histogram. So that's the area between your midtones and your whites. And moving your highlights up and down actually changes this part. So if you look at, let's say, this little block on our color checker, if I move highlights around, you'll see that block change quite a bit. So it goes to white on this side, it goes down, and it affects the other areas a lot less. So you'll see, for instance, if you're looking at this dark block, which is sitting in the shadows, if I change my highlights, it's really unaffected by what's happening. The colors at the top are affected because they're close to, they're close to midtone, but my shadows, in this case, this block, you'll see is really not doing anything when I'm changing my highlights. But right over here in my bright areas of this image, the highlights is actually dropping them down a lot and making them a lot brighter if I go the other way. So what does this do? In a normal sort of landscape situation or cityscape situation, your highlights is generally your sky. So if you want to darken your sky or lighten your sky, this is the slider you would go to, because your sky generally in a well-exposed image would be sitting right here in your highlights. Then the next one is just the other side. This area, it's our shadow area. So this is the darker areas, but not black. Just like our highlight areas, our lighter areas, but not white. Okay. So looking at our shadows, if we drop down our shadow area, this block that's in basically in the shadow tones will get closer to black and go pretty much black all the way to this side. If we lighten it going towards the other side, we will get it to look very bright. So that basically affects the darker or the shadow areas as we define this side of our histogram when we're looking at it. We'll see how we can use that also just now when we get to an edit. Whites, this is the complete white right-hand side of our histogram or of the tonal range of this image. So if we go right, the whites and anything close to white will go completely white. And going the other way is we'll bring it down, so it will make whites go a little bit more towards gray. And the last one is our blacks. So that's the left-hand edge of our histogram. And if we go brighter with our blacks, we'll turn our blacks more gray. So you'll see this go more gray, or anything that's close to black. And if we go the other way, anything that's close to black will then turn black. So this will make our shadows deeper and darker, will give us back some of the detail in the shadow area. So if there's something that you can barely see but it's very dark, and you slide this slider this way, it will start giving you some detail there. Similar to in the next part of it, if something is sitting in the shadows but you can just barely make out it's there, then you can also move up your shadow area to get some detail back. And again, there's no set recipe to follow when it comes to editing with these sliders. So what I generally suggest is making sure you understand what all these do, and then forming a picture in your mind of what the mood of your image needs to be and how you want to edit your image and what end result you will have. So sometimes you want a lot of dark areas and you want your exposure to be darker to get a very moody feel. If you're taking photos at night, you actually don't want to be pushing your exposure up to get like gray skies. You want your skies and your dark areas to go to black, and only where there's light, whether it's stars, the moon, or light from buildings or cars, you only want the light areas to be bright. The dark areas should go towards black because that's the way we see it at night. So knowing what you're looking at, maybe a scene on a beach where you took a photo on a beach, you want it to be very bright. So you need to be editing towards that mood, towards that feel, towards the story you want to tell. And it's not just following a recipe and editing all your images to be exactly mid-tone, the exact same way. So we'll have a look at a couple of examples. And again, if anybody's got questions so far on any of these sliders, let me know. Just before we hop into the examples, all these areas you can adjust on the point curve. So when you're starting out with Lightroom, these sliders are probably your best bet. And even me editing hundreds and thousands of images a week sometimes, when I get back from photo shoots, the fastest way for me to edit is using these sliders because I can isolate different areas of the image and the tones and get the exact look I'm going for. Although if you're doing something maybe like fine art and you want real fine control over an image, especially in black and white maybe, then you might want to look at your point curve. So this is your overall tones, but you can also adjust reds, greens, blues independently on your tone curve. When we get to look at color, we'll also cover that. But for now, if it's on this first little toggle at the top, you're basically adjusting all the same things you can adjust at the top. You've just got more control. So for instance, if we add a few dots and you just click on it and it will add these little dots for you on the line, we can, for instance, just lighten our highlights, drop our highlights. This is our shadow area. We can affect our shadow area if we want to. And we can also affect our blacks. So this is just moving our blacks around, similar to when we're using the slider. And on the other side, we can also move our whites around. So we can increase or decrease our whites. You can see on the right-hand side of the histogram, my whites are moving around. When you're starting out, this is probably not the place where you want to be editing. Generally, starting off, you want to avoid this point curve and just use the sliders. But having the understanding that whatever you're doing in this point curve is basically moving around these sliders as well. Okay. You can affect your contrast also, just as another example. So I can increase contrast by doing a point curve like this, and it's got exactly the same effect as moving my contrast around. I've just got a little bit more fine control on how exactly I'm moving the different tones around. So let's hop in and check an example. Okay, we also had a little tone curve just to show you very quickly on the histogram at the top. Each one of these bars has got a different tone and you'll see all of them there. So from white to black, and each one of these bars represent one of these. So again, increasing contrast moves them apart, decreasing contrast moves them closer. So you've got a nice visual way of checking what it does. Exposure obviously moves everything to the right or to the left, darker or lighter. That gives you a good idea. Highlights will affect my highlight areas and drop them down. You can see the highlights dropping down there. I can also make them brighter by going the other way. Similar for shadows. And having a nice example image like this to play around with and see what these different sliders do is generally a really good idea. So this is affecting my whites. So you'll see this slider is not doing anything on the left half of my image because it's only affecting my whites. This one is only going to change the left half and leaving my right half alone. Just to show you exactly what these do. Let's go back to images. Now, this is an example, and we were saying, should you always underexpose or overexpose, or just shoot it at the midpoint in your exposure on your camera? In this case, I actually underexposed on purpose. So what my camera was telling me for this shot, when I put it in manual mode and I adjusted everything to where my light meter in my camera said, you've now got a well-exposed image, I got a pretty gray sky. I had a lot of detail here. It was very gray in this image. So what I did in camera is I dropped my exposure, I think almost 2 stops. So if I increase my exposure right here in Lightroom to about 2 stops, this is the image that Lightroom wanted me, oh, my camera wanted me to take. Okay, so if you look at this image, to me, that's not what I saw while walking there. It was dark, it was moody, there was tiny lights from the building there in Rosebank, and if I listen to my camera, I got this image. You'll see the sky is sort of gray at the back. The sky wasn't gray, the sky was black. A lot of this detail that my camera could see when I set it to basically do the exposure my camera wanted to do, a lot of that I couldn't really see just by walking around there. And so what I did, because I wanted a specific mood and I wanted it to look closer to what it looked to me walking around there, it was dark, it was late at night, I actually dropped my exposure in camera by 2 stops. So what did I get? I got this image. So this is a case where, knowing the mood I was going for, knowing the image I was going for, looking for all this black area, all this space in the image where there's no detail, on purpose I dropped my exposure by 2 stops. So now, looking at my histogram, a lot of people, if you don't show them the image and I show them just this histogram, they will tell me this is a way underexposed image. I'm losing detail in the blacks. There's no detail from midtones really to highlights. There's a tiny little highlight at the end, but there's really very little detail here, and they would say this is a completely underexposed image. Although to me, looking at it, this is exactly what I wanted, and this is the mood and the feeling that I saw when I was actually there. Now we can tweak this a tiny bit. Like I said, the exposure I already got correct in the camera the way I wanted it. But what we can do just to enhance a little bit in this edit is we can up the contrast a tiny bit. So this is pushing the light areas and the dark areas further away from each other and just maybe enhancing that mood of the image a tiny bit more. The highlight areas, if I move this around, this is really only going to affect that really bright areas where the lights are shining. So you can see if I drop it down, you'll see the lights go dim. And if I go to the right, I'm going to increase the light areas in this image. So I'm going to go a little bit up on the highlights. My shadow areas, this is an interesting one. So I could go 2 ways. I could increase detail in something like the road if I push my shadow areas to the right, or I can decrease some of the detail in areas like the roads if I go left. Now in this case, I might just want to add a tiny bit of detail to the shadows, not too much, because to me, I think the mood of this is that the difference and the contrast between the light and the dark is actually what gives me a lot of the mood for this image. And so I don't want to lighten the shadows too much and bring too much detail back into this image. I've got another question. Are the sliders calibrated in f-stops? Generally not. And if it also depends a lot if you're editing a JPEG image in Lightroom or if you're editing a RAW image. Some of these things will make sense in relation to what you set in your camera. So as one example, if you are editing a RAW image, which means your white balance, for instance, is not built into the actual image that you get out, and you're moving your white balance slider, you'll get a Kelvin reading. If you actually took a JPEG image, that white balance that your camera set at is baked into your JPEG image already, and if you are adjusting that, you're just getting a slider that goes more blue to the one side or more red to the other side, so you can adjust the warmth of your image, but there's no real value connected to it. So editing that JPEG then removed our ability to specify the Kelvin value for our white balance. Now, very similarly, a slider like our exposure slider actually does stops. So if we go 0.3 plus, then we've actually just increased by 1/3 of a stop our exposure, and that would give a similar result to what we did in camera. So if I know I actually underexposed in camera by 2 stops, I can do the reverse here and know, well, this is pretty much what my camera wanted to do, and if I go back to 0, this is what I actually did by going -2 in camera on my exposure. That makes sense. So this exposure slider will give you stops, yes. Let's go over a stop. So this is back to this edit. This is looking good for me. Shadows we've pushed up a tiny bit, and again, not too much, because I don't want too much detail in this road. The road is not the focus for me. This part of the image is the focus. So we've got the lights on the left, we've got this hotel entrance that's lit up, and we've got the single light on the other side. And that's sort of the focus of the image for what I'm trying to do here. Now, shadows, we are done with whites. Whites, I think I might move a tiny little bit just to see what it does to that light and the car's lights. What I'm going to do while doing this is I'm going to hold Alt as soon as I grab the slider. So if I grab the slider, can't really see what it's doing on the image. I can see it's getting a bit brighter and less bright on those lights. But if I hold Alt, I'll get this image where I can see what's actually completely white when I go to the right, and what's completely, what's not blowing out as I go left. So basically, it doesn't matter if I drop my whites all the way, there's still going to be completely white areas, which is exactly in the middle of those lights or lamps. They are completely white, which is fine. And as I go right, some of that building is going to turn completely white, and I don't want that. So I'm going back to where basically just those very bright areas like the car's headlights, and that light on the side of the building is going to be white. I'm going to leave it there. So now I'm happy with my whites, and it only went up by 3 on that. I'm going to do a similar thing on the blacks. Hold Alt, and now I can see if I go right, there's going to be no blacks in my image. Obviously, this is a night shot. I want quite a lot of black in this image. So I'm going to move it to the left to make sure that I'm getting a fairly good amount of black, complete black in this image, because to give me that night feel to it. It might be a tiny bit much. There we go. So right there, I think, is a good balance between having some detail, but having that feeling of this is at night. It's dark, it's contrasty, and there's some light shining. So that's pretty much where I will stop with this specific edit. I could crop it still, maybe straighten it a tiny bit, and then what I might do if I really want to work a lot on this image is I could do some local adjustments, maybe just lighten up right in front of the car a little bit, maybe get some of the other detail that I might not really need in this image to go darker by doing local adjustments. But we'll get to the local adjustment or masking panel later, where we can do some dodging and burning in one of the later sessions in this series. For now, we're just going to leave it right there, and I think this is a good edit on this. The thing to understand with this image is I underexposed by 2 stops on purpose to get a specific mood. And even though my histogram looks like it's completely underexposed, when I'm looking at the image, that's what I want. So sometimes we have to not just trust the camera, but think about what we're trying to convey with our images. Let's go to the opposite example of that. So this is a snow image, and if I didn't show anybody this image, just showed them the histogram, they would say this is completely overexposed. But when I'm looking at the image, that's exactly what it should have been. And again, my camera wanted to do something like this, and I actually overexposed by, where was it? So it was something like this. So 1 2/3. That was what my camera wanted to do. It looked at this image, it saw all the white, all the brightness, and it wanted to drop the exposure to get a nice exposed mid-tone-ish image. You get a very similar effect if you're taking images in snow and also on the beach. So anything that's very bright, white walls behind people, white walls in studio as well, your camera might want to tell you to drop your exposure, or if you put it in full auto, you're going to get an image that looks like this. So the beach turns gray, the snow turns gray, and that's not what it looks like when you're there and looking at it. So you get home, especially maybe with your mobile phone camera, if you just leave it in auto and you take images, and all your snow images look like this. And same thing with your beach images. And you actually need to go into exposure and lift it by maybe a stop to 2 stops even sometimes. And then you get back to what it actually looked like. So you could do this in camera, or you could do it afterwards in Lightroom or whatever editing software you're using. In this case, I did it in camera, so I on purpose, I was using aperture priority, and I dialed my exposure compensation up by 1 2/3 to get a very white image, because that's exactly what it looked like. How would we edit something like this? Well, firstly, if it was underexposed and if it was grayish, I would just push up my exposure. In this case, I already did it in camera, so I don't have to do it now. What else can we do? I would probably increase contrast a tiny bit just to get some darker areas to go darker, to have a nice difference between the snow, the sky that was a complete whiteout sort of blizzard going on, and the dark areas of this car especially, and some of this foliage where there's dark areas underneath. So I would just push up the contrast a tiny bit to get the dark areas to go darker, the lighter areas to go lighter. The next thing we might want to do is I might drop the highlights just a tiny little bit, just to get my sky a tiny bit darker, but really in effect for the mood of this image it doesn't do much, and there's no clouds. It was all white out blizzard, so dropping it doesn't really give us any detail back here, because there is really no detail. There was no detail. Shadow areas are looking pretty good to me. What I might do is just drop my blacks a tiny bit while we're looking at shadows, just to get the blacks again here on the car to go a little bit darker. I like that extra contrast. The whites we can go up a little bit again to increase our contrast. So just for your knowledge, going up in whites and down in blacks will increase contrast as well overall in your image. So similar to actually adding a bit of contrast. Now the last thing I will do, and this is not in the light panel, but when I'm editing for the mood and the feel of this, it was super cold, it was snow, and to get that mood, what I would do is, instead of going with the white balance as shot and what my camera thought, I might just push it down a little bit towards the blue side, just to give that, looking at it, you can almost feel that it was cold. And that's pretty much all I would do in this case. So realizing that your camera can actually get exposure wrong when you're taking images, and knowing how to compensate for that is good. So if you're taking images of very dark scenes, your camera might want to lighten it up to get a normal exposure. And taking images of very light scenes, or where there's a lot of white or bright things in the scene, your camera might want to push your exposure down to get back to like midtones, and you might not want that. So just realize that dark images, you either have to darken them in camera or in post when you're editing. Light images, you might very often have to lighten them up either in camera, consciously while you're doing it, or afterwards in Lightroom. Then our last example, editing example. This is typically what might happen. So walking around in the city, finding this awesome guy in Braamfontein, having a chat with him. Really nice portrait, really friendly guy. And what happened was, I was underexposing a tiny bit, as a lot of people would do when walking around doing street photos, just to preserve some sky detail. I had to work quick, and I took this portrait. So what you can see is no detail in his face, and obviously that's where we want to focus with the portrait, and it's really important to get some of that detail back. Now looking at my histogram, there's information pretty much throughout except the last bit. There's no real light, very light information in this, because I actually underexposed I would guess by almost a stop in this case. Having overexposed this would have meant that I would have no detail in his shirt. You can actually still see all the detail in his shirt. You can see all the little all the weave of the fabric and the detail in the whites. So if I did overexpose this detail would have been gone. Similar to what might happen if you are taking images at a wedding, something similar to that. The wedding dresses very often gets overexposed and you lose the detail in that and it just goes white. So in this case, I'm safe on that side. There's nothing going white, but I'm definitely a bit underexposed. I've got stuff going towards the shadow and the black side, which I might not want. This is a raw image, so I've got some leeway to try and save this. So the first thing I might just have a look at is it possible to save this? Is there detail? Can I actually get detail in his face back? So I'll just up the exposure, and that tells me there's definitely detail there in the shadows. I can actually see his face quite clearly. I can see his eyes. So there's a lot of detail that I'll be able to recover. So this is a quick check just to see if the image is, I might be able to save it or not. So this is something that very often also happens when I'm doing street portraits, quick street portraits with the light from behind. So if the sun is behind somebody and I'm exposing maybe with matrix metering my camera, evaluative metering on some of the other cameras, basically the metering that looks at the whole scene. You're using that and maybe even underexposing by a third or 2/3, you very often end up with very shadowy faces and the scene behind, the light, the sky behind is very bright, not overexposed. And then you get a similar situation as this image where faces are too dark. Luckily, in this case, we know we can save it. And in a lot of cases out on the street, when you're doing this, you can save those images. Now, how do we go about that? First thing I'm going to do is I know there's a lot of shadow detail, so I'm going to increase my shadows. Just going to push towards the right until I see some detail get back. And in this case, sort of an extreme example, I'm going all the way on my shadow slider, or almost all the way. I don't want to go quite there, but I'm going like plus 80 out of 100, which is right at the end. I'm getting a lot of that detail back in his face already. Next thing I might do is just look at my exposure slider and see what's going to help this. I'm just going to nudge it up a tiny little bit and then look at blacks and whites. So blacks sliding to the left, holding Alt. I can see there's a tiny bit of black there. My white sliding to the right. So there I'm starting to see white in his shirt. I'm going to leave it there. My highlights. I actually want to push my highlights a little bit brighter to get that back wall and his shirt a tiny bit whiter. Because remember when we had the original image like this, we had this gap on the right hand side in the highlights. So I'm trying to get some of the information back towards the bright side. Now you can see I've got we've got a big white shirt, which I know should be sitting on the highlight side, and we've got it right there. One way to check if you are trying to check skin tones and where the target icon, I'm going to go and just hover it over my image. So there, generally a good place is also on the forehead or on the cheek, on a bright area to check where the exposure is. And you'll see right over here on this point curve, you'll see a little dot moving around. So this is sitting sort of in my shadow area. The shirt is sitting on my highlights area. You'll see the little dot moving around there. That's a very bright area here on his shoulder. The back wall is a little bit brighter than midtone. Over here, we're getting midtones again. So this is a quick way just to check where my exposure is. And because I know his skin tone should be just below the middle of that graph, or maybe even sitting on that middle, we are very close. So looking at a brighter spot here on his forehead, the skin tones are quite close. I might want to just lift it a tiny bit more to get more to a realistic skin tone there. I'm going to just push my exposure a tiny bit more and check again. Now we're sitting pretty much straight in the middle. And with lighter skin tones, you actually want to sit a little bit to the right of middle. And this is where cameras might get these things wrong. You need to go back in and fix the skin tones to be where they should be to get a good exposure. I'm pretty happy with what I'm seeing right now. So what we did was a little bit of exposure to get some of that detail back in the shadows and push things over to the brighter side. We lightened the shadows a lot, moved our highlights a little bit to the right to get things in midtones. Blacks we made a little bit, we dropped a little bit just to get the black areas like the writing and things to be closer to the black. And I think we are almost there. Just to finish off, what I would do in a case like this, and again, these other tools we will get to in future sessions, but cropping is definitely something I would do in a case like this. So maybe a crop like that would be nice. Maybe just moving him a tiny bit more towards the center of this. And this crop will allow people to read this writing on his pocket a bit better. I think that's a better crop to get people's attention to focus on his pocket there. And then what I also might just do in a case like this, put in a tiny bit of a vignette, dropping this down, not too much, but a tiny bit of a vignette just to get these corners to go a little bit darker so that our focus is right there on his face. And I think when we get to colors as well, we will probably see what all these, or we'll definitely cover all these color grading tools. But what I did is I just added a tiny bit of warmth or orange into the midtones just to get a nice glowing skin there. And I think that would pretty much cover my edits on this specific image. We can spend a lot more time on the color side of it, but I think that explains these sliders a lot. So if we go back to the original image, and this is in monochrome, there's no detail, we can't see his eyes, there's no skin detail, it all goes to black. We're just getting the sheer detail, and after we try to save this image, we've actually got a very usable, very nice image that I think tells a good story in this case. Any more questions at this stage? Just giving a bit of time. If anybody's got questions, pop them in the chat. While we're waiting for the questions, just a reminder again, there's a MailChimp group if you want email reminders when these videos are available. There's also a WhatsApp group if you want reminders of when we're going live with the links, also reminders when the replays are available. So every week on a Tuesday, we're doing a new live stream, and then a couple of days later I will add things like the timestamps to specific things we did in the videos and send out that reminder as well. Next week, so that you can anticipate what we're doing, we're moving down in these panels, and the next panel we're going to have a look at is color. So we'll be doing some color fixes, fixing images where the color's gone off for different reasons. And we'll look also at, because we've already now done this light panel, how the light panel actually influences our color in the image and how we can fix things, especially things like skin tones. That should be good. We'll also look at how we can use color to get a specific mood. Cropping and resizing, yeah, definitely, absolutely. One other tip, very often when I'm editing images, I would crop first. So even though Lightroom is built so that you generally work down this whole panel from the top to the bottom, so the last things you should be doing is adding things like effects and sharpening and these things that you should be doing right at the end. The first thing Lightroom really wants you to do is fix your exposure and your tones and get the light in your image to be correct. So But the one exception to moving down this edit panel is I would suggest cropping first. Doing your crop, the very first thing you do is crop your image. The reason for this is it actually affects your exposure. So let's do something like this. Let's go back to our little color picker chart here. Why am I not seeing it? I'm not. No, Lightroom is not coming back. All good. But basically what I'm trying to explain is, let's say you've got an image with a big white area in it, or a very bright area in it, and a very dark area in it. If you change your crop, you're basically changing the histogram and the exposure of your overall image. So what I would suggest is, before even fixing any light issues or doing exposure changes, crop first so that you can get a good idea of what the exposure of that area of your image that you're actually going to be using is. And once you've got that area set, then go into your light panel and fix any issues, because then your histogram will actually be a good reflection of what you're seeing in that already cropped image. Let me see if there's any other questions. Yeah, how do I get back to original and edited images, please? Okay, let me show you in Lightroom. Let me open an image and then we can work from there. My Lightroom is just a tiny bit slow right now. I think it might be backing up to the cloud. Let me find a good example for us to look at, and I'll show you different ways of getting back to original images in Lightroom. The shortcut, by the way, if you just want to see your unedited image before and after you actually edited it, is to press backslash. So on the keyboard, backslash will show the image unedited. So that you can actually compare your before and after images. So you just hit backslash on your keyboard, it will show you the before, hit backslash again, it will show you the after edit. On all the different panels, Lightroom has also got a little eye button. It looks like an eye, and if you click on it and you hold it, it will just hide the edits you did with that specific panel. So if you did any specific edits, maybe in the color section, if you click on that eye and you hold it, it will hide those edits specifically, but leave all the other edits you did untouched, and then it will bring that back. I'm just waiting for my Lightroom still. I would love to show you what it looks like. You might just have to do that question again in the next session. I'm just waiting again. It's still a little bit slow. But yeah, so there's different ways of rolling back and seeing your unedited image. So like I said, one is just hitting backslash, and again to get back to your edited image. One is to press the little eye button so that it hides specific edits, like the color section or the light section or the effects section, so you can see exactly what that specific section did to your edit. And then the other thing is, Lightroom these days, on the new Lightroom, is it automatically saves versions of your image. So if you go to your edit panel, right at the bottom, there's a thing, a big block that says versions. If you click on that, there's some automatic versions, like it saves your imported image as it was when you imported it. And then as you edit, it might decide this is a good time and it saves another version of your image. You can also go there by yourself. And if you are not sure if you like your edit, you can then click on versions. You can go on named. You can save your own one and give it a name. You can go edit version 1. You can then click on your original again and it rolls it back to the original. You can do another edit and then name it as edit version 2. And when you get to edit version 2, you can then go back to versions and click on the two names and see two different versions of your own edits. which is quite nice. I use this versioning system of Lightroom very often, especially when I'm doing client work. Maybe if it's let's say it's for a magazine or something, I might do 2 or 3 different edits for them, and then they can choose one that fits them. Or if it's for a brand, a specific company, they can choose one that fits with the look and the feel of what they're going for in their campaign or advertising or something. So being able to name different versions is quite nice. So you could go, one name could be dark and moody, the other one could be nice and bright and warm, and you could present 2 different versions and quickly switch between the 2, which is quite nice. Any other questions? Okay. Hopefully that answers all your exposure related and tone curve related questions for now. Send me any examples if you want me to have a look at any specific images. Send me any questions. I will happily answer that through the next week as well. Thank you for joining. I'm going to give a couple of seconds for another question. If nothing comes in, we will call it a night. Good stuff. I think that covers it then. Thank you for joining. There will be another one of these sessions next week. And like I said, then we'll be looking at color and the color panel and how we adjust those things. And we'll also specifically focus on skin tones and getting skin tones correct. I hope you join for that one. If you are not on the WhatsApp group or the mailing list, just contact me and I will, yeah, just contact me on the directly, and I will point you to the mailing list subscription or the WhatsApp group. Great. We've got one quick question still, and it's about storage and filing. Yeah, definitely. So we did workflow previously. We looked at storage, we looked at filing, and the system I use for organizing my images. What we could do in a future session, definitely, if there's a need, and I think there will be, because it's something that took me a while to figure out, is the settings in Lightroom and how to point it to actually store your images either in your internal hard drive or an external hard drive. Is it only saving previews of images, or is it saving the actual original images in these spots? You can set up all these things. Yeah, we'll definitely have a look at that. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to end it right there then.